Under a sky the color of bleached bone, Clara Hayes rode into the town of Dry Creek with her skirts coated in dust and her mule staggering under the weight of what little she owned. The sun glared down like it aimed to burn the land clean of life, and the wind carried nothing but the scrape of sand against skin. Wells had gone dry months ago. Even the riverbed, once the town's spine, lay cracked and hollow. She could taste the drought in the air, the way a man might taste copper before a nosebleed. She passed shuttered storefronts and boardwalks sagging under their own age. A pair of men slouched against the wall of a saloon, eyes tracking her like she might be a meal they couldn't afford to buy. She kept her gaze forward. A stranger with a stubborn look and a mule in tow wasn't worth trouble in a place like this, but they were hungry enough for trouble to try. A half-empty trough sat in the middle of the street, water so low the horses' muzzles barely dipped in. She didn't stop. She didn't have enough to spare. Every drop in the dented canteen at her hip had been rationed for days. Past the town's edge, the land turned meaner. Dry grass snapped under the mule's hooves. Fence posts leaned like old men, their wires sagging. Clara had been told there was one ranch still holding water, the Black Place. Rumor said the man who owned it didn't like company. Said he'd turned his shotgun on more than one thirsty drifter. She didn't plan to beg. By the time she reached the property line, her throat was raw from the dust. A weather-beaten sign, half swallowed by weeds, read Black Ranch in faded letters. Beyond it stretched parched pasture and a few stubborn cattle, ribs showing through hide. At the far end, the ranch house sat square and solitary, a windmill creaking faintly in the dead air. She took 3 steps past the sign before the voice came. That's far enough. It was deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Clara looked toward the porch. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, holding a shotgun like it was just another tool in his hands. His hat shadowed his face, but she caught the set of his jaw, stone-hard. "I'm here to see Jonas Black," she said, not slowing. "You've seen him. Then you know I've come for water." The barrel of the shotgun shifted, not quite aimed, but not far from it. "This land's for my stock. Water's for them, too. I'm not looking for charity." She stopped just shy of the gate, met his gaze through the heat shimmer. "I can find you more. Underground springs. If you let me stay." A pause. The only sound was the groan of the windmill and the low cough of one of the cattle. "Had a half-dozen folks tell me that since the wells dried," he said, "all of 'em liars. I'm not lying. Doesn't matter." He cocked the shotgun, not loud but enough. "Turn that mule around." Clara studied him, the deep lines carved into his sun-browned skin, the hollowness in his eyes that spoke of more than just a year without rain. "You lose much in the drought?" His mouth twitched, not into a smile, but something colder. "Everything worth speaking of." The gate stood between them like a drawn line in the dirt. She could walk away, but walking away meant dying slow in the dust. She unhitched the mule, led it to a bare patch of shade by the fence, and sat down with her canteen. He frowned. "You deaf? I heard you fine." She took a sip, small enough to hurt. "I'm not leaving." His eyes narrowed, weighing her stubbornness against the cost of dealing with it. "Suit yourself. But you won't last." That night, the land went quiet except for the restless shuffle of cattle. Clara lay under the mule's shadow, her bedroll thin against the hard ground. The stars above were bright as glass shards. Somewhere in the dark, she heard boots pacing on the porch. He was watching her. At dawn, she rose before the sun burned the horizon red. Without a word, she took a shovel from her wagon and walked toward the dry creek bed she'd passed on the way in. The ground there was cracked, but not too deep. She could feel it under her feet, the faintest give, the kind her father had taught her meant water was buried far below. She drove the shovel into the earth. The sound of metal biting dirt was steady, almost defiant in the empty morning. Sweat ran down her neck before the sun cleared the ridge. "Thought I told you move on." His voice came from behind her, closer than before. She didn't look up. "You did. You planning to dig a grave for yourself out here? If it finds water, you can keep the grave. A dry, rustle made her freeze. Her eyes flicked down. Not 3 feet away, a rattlesnake coiled, head up, tail buzzing in warning. She gripped the shovel tighter, but knew she couldn't swing fast enough. A single crack split the air. The snake jerked once, then lay still, dust settling around it. Jonas stood behind her, smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. She nodded once in thanks, then drove the shovel back into the dirt. He watched her for a long moment, then grunted, "One day. You've got one day to prove it." By midday, her hands blistered under the worn wood handle. Jonas leaned against a fence post, silent, but she could feel his eyes on her. She worked the soil in widening circles, noting the clay's color shift, the smell changing from baked earth to something darker, cooler. Her heart beat faster. This was it. She knelt, scooping away the last few inches with her hands. Her fingers hit dampness. Not much, but enough to stain the dirt. She held it up to him. Jonas stepped closer, crouched, touched the soil himself. He brought it to his nose, inhaled. "Could be a pocket," he said. "Could be nothing. Could be the difference between life and death." They stared at each other, the dust and heat swirling around them. Then, slowly, he straightened. "You've got the rest of the day," he said, "and I'll dig with you." The sun sank low, shadows stretching long. Sweat streaked both their faces, their shirts clinging. The hold deepened, the air growing cooler as they worked. Jonas's breath came heavy but steady, and Clara matched his rhythm. When the first trickle seeped into the bottom, it was so faint it could have been imagined. But then it grew, pooling in the dirt, darkening it. Jonas froze, staring at it like he'd seen a ghost. Clara smiled, slow and sure. "Told you." He didn't answer, just knelt to scoop a handful. The water was gritty, lukewarm, but it was water. He swallowed once, then looked at her. Not the way a man looks at a liar or a trespasser, but like someone seeing the start of a thing he thought was long gone. The windmill creaked. Somewhere in the pasture, a cow lowed, almost hopefully. And for the first time in a year, Jonas Black didn't feel quite so alone. The water that seeped from the earth was the color of weak tea, but to Jonas it looked like salvation. By the next morning, they dug the hole wider, lined it with rock, and let it deepen overnight. The pool was still small, but it held steady, the earth feeding it from some underground vein. Jonas had risen before dawn to test it again, crouching with a tin cup to draw it up. It tasted faintly of clay and root, but it was cold. Cold enough to make the back of his throat ache. Clara came up behind him, her boots scuffing the dust. She had a braid over one shoulder, loose hairs plastered against her face with sweat. "Good enough to drink?" she asked. "It'll do," he said, and handed her the cup. She took a sip, her eyes closing for a moment. "That's the first time in months I've tasted something that wasn't half a lie." Jonas let the words settle between them. She had the kind of stubborn hope that could get a person killed out here, but it was the same kind that might keep a ranch alive. And he'd already seen too many people give up. By mid-morning, they'd hauled stones from the creek bed and built up a low wall to keep the silt from collapsing back in. Clara showed him how to fashion a crude cover from planks and tar cloth, keep out snakes, thieves, and the worst of the dust. When they stepped back, Jonas couldn't help feeling that the place looked less like a graveyard and more like something that belonged to the living. The sound of hooves cut through the dry air. Jonas's shoulders stiffened. From the rise beyond the fence, 2 riders came into view. Their horses looked lean and restless, their riders leaner still, faces shaded under low-brimmed hats. Clara glanced at him. "Friends of yours?" He didn't answer, only wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward the porch. The men slowed their horses near the gate, but didn't dismount. Black, the taller one, called, "Heard you might have a little water left to trade." Jonas's gaze shifted to their canteens, full, from the way they hung heavy at their sides. "I'm not trading," he said. The shorter man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you are. Just a matter of finding the right price." Jonas rested a hand near the butt of his revolver. "Price ain't in coin." The tall one's smile flattened. "We'll remember that." He turned his horse, and the pair rode off slow, as if they wanted the dust they left behind to linger in the air between them. Clara watched them go. Water rustlers? Of a kind, Jonas said. They don't always take it by force. Sometimes they just make sure a man's got no choice but to give it over. They'll be back. Yeah, he said, and his voice made it clear he'd been thinking the same thing. They spent the rest of the day working the ranch. Clara mended the fence line, tying new wire where it sagged, while Jonas fixed the trough near the barn. Every so often his eyes would flick to the road, but no riders appeared. When evening came, Clara took to the small patch of earth behind the house, what had once been a kitchen garden. The soil there was cracked, but she turned it over with a hoe, mixing in damp earth from a new spring. Jonas came to watch. You thinking you can grow something here? He asked. Tomatoes. Maybe beans. If we're lucky. He gave a short laugh. Luck's been in short supply. Then we'll make our own, she said, not looking up. Her hands were sure in the dirt, the way a person's are when they've done the work long enough to know its rhythm. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters and moaning through the rafters. Jonas lay in bed, listening to it, feeling the way the dry air seemed to pull the moisture from his skin. Somewhere in the dark, a plank shifted with a loud crack. He rose, pulled on his boots, and went out with a lantern. The cover on the new well was flapping loose, the tar cloth threatening to tear away. He set the lantern down and tried to fasten it, but the wind fought him. Then Clara was there, hair whipped loose, hands already on the boards. They worked together in silence, the storm pelting them with grit until their skin stung. By the time it was done, both were coughing from the dust. Jonas looked at her in the lantern light, the streak of dirt across her cheek, the flash of determination in her eyes. You should have stayed inside, he said. You should have tied it tighter the first time, she shot back. For the first time in a long while, he felt the corner of his mouth twitch toward a smile. The next morning brought no wind, just the same dry heat. But there was a stillness in the air that Jonas didn't trust. He was in the barn repairing a bridle when Clara came in, her face tight. Riders, she said. Jonas set down the leather and stepped outside. The same two men from before were at the gate. But this time they'd brought another, bigger, with a rifle slung across his back. We've been thinking about that price, the tall one said. Seeing as the drought's not likely to break soon, seems smart to secure a steady source. Jonas walked to the gate, his boots crunching on the hard earth. You're not getting my water. The big man leaned forward in his saddle. Ain't yours if you can't keep it. Clara came to stand beside Jonas. And if you try to take it, you'll find out just how well he can. The three men looked her over, but none of them laughed. The big one spat into the dust. We'll be seeing you. They left, but their meaning stayed behind. Jonas felt it settle over the place like a shadow. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Clara asked, How many men like that do you think are out there? Enough, he said. And if they come back? Then we hold our ground. She nodded, as if that settled it, but he could see the thoughts moving behind her eyes. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. Clara hauled water from the spring to the trough, learning the weight of each bucket. Jonas rode the fence lines, making sure there were no gaps. They shared few words, but in the quiet moments, over coffee in the morning or when the sun bled red into the horizon, they began to read each other without speaking. One night, with the air cool enough to stand outside without sweating, Jonas found her at the garden again. She was kneeling, pressing seeds into the damp soil. What are those? He asked. Squash. My mother swore they could grow anywhere. She covered them gently, patting the earth down. I'm hoping she was right. He stood there for a while, watching. I buried my wife out here, he said finally, up on the North Ridge. Fever took her last spring. Clara didn't look up. I lost my place 2 years ago. Husband ran it into the ground with cards and drink. I left before he could do the same to me. Neither spoke for a long while after that. 3 days later, Jonas was tightening the hinges on the barn door when he heard it, gunfire in the distance. Not close, but close enough to carry on the dry air. He straightened, scanning the horizon. Clara stepped out of the house, eyes wide. You think it's them? She asked. Could be, he said. His hand went to the revolver on his hip. The shots came again, then faded. Silence returned, heavier than before. That night, Jonas left the lantern burning low and kept the rifle by the door. Clara didn't argue. Neither slept much. At dawn, the riders came. This time there were 4 of them, moving at a steady lope down the road, dust trailing behind. Jonas stepped off the porch, rifle in hand. Clara stood at his side, the shovel she'd used to dig, the spring resting against her shoulder like a weapon. The lead rider smiled, showing teeth. "Morning, Black. We've come to make a withdrawal." Jonas lifted the rifle, and the man's smile stayed fixed, though his eyes narrowed. "You can ride away now," Jonas said, "or you can ride away lighter." The standoff stretched in the heat. Then the big man from before swung down from his horse, hand drifting toward the butt of his pistol. Clara shifted her grip on the shovel, the wood worn smooth where her hands had been. A hawk screamed overhead. No one moved. Finally, the leader spat into the dust. "Not worth the trouble today." He mounted again, and they rode off slow, the promise of return hanging in the air like a storm that never breaks. Jonas let out a slow breath. Clara didn't. "They'll be back," she said. "I know. And next time." His jaw set. "Next time we'll be ready." The water in the spring rippled faintly in the breeze, the sun catching on its surface. It was still there, still feeding life into the parched earth. And for now, that was enough to keep them both standing. The morning came quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet a man trusted. Jonas stood on the porch with his coffee cooling in his hand, scanning the road that wound through the flats toward town. The dust hung low and still, like the land was holding its breath. Somewhere far off, a crow called, the sound carrying too far in the brittle air. Clara stepped out beside him, tucking her braid under her hat. "They'll come today," she said. Jonas didn't argue. He'd been thinking the same thing since he opened his eyes. The rustlers had given him too much peace the last time. That meant they were planning. He set his cup down and checked the rifle leaning against the wall. "Get the cover on the well. Tight." She was already moving before he finished the words, boots striking the hard ground as she crossed the spring. The boards fit snug, the tar cloth lashed down with rope. She pressed her palm to the wood once, like she was making a promise, then looked toward him. The first sign came an hour later, dust rising from the south, a thin line at first, then thicker, spreading out like smoke from a slow fire. Jonas counted shapes in the haze. 6 this time. They came in at a trot, spread wide. All wore pistols, and 2 had rifles in their hands already. The leader, the tall one from before, brought his horse to a stop just beyond the gate. "Black," he called, "we gave you fair warning." Jonas stepped down from the porch, rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. "You gave me nothing worth hearing." The leader's eyes slid to Clara, who stood a few paces back, shovel in hand. "You planning to hide behind a woman?" Jonas didn't look away from a man. "She's not hiding." The leader nodded to one of his riders, who spurred forward. Jonas lifted the rifle, the sound of the lever snapping into place sharp in the still air. The rider pulled up, not eager to be the first to fall. "This is your last chance," the leader said. "We take the water, you keep the land. You fight us, you lose both." Jonas shifted his stance, feet set firm. "You want it, come get it." The first shot cracked from a far left, kicking dirt near Jonas's boot. He dropped to a knee and fired back, his round taking a chip out of a saddle horn and sending the rider swearing. Then the air filled with gunfire, sharp and ringing, echoing off the barn. Clara darted toward the side fence, staying low, circling toward the trough where 2 riders had dismounted. One lunged for the well cover, knife flashing to cut the rope. She swung the shovel in a tight arc, the edge slamming into his side with a hollow thud. He staggered, lost his grip on the knife, and she kicked it away. Jonas dropped another man with a shot to the leg, the rider tumbling into the dust. He chambered another round, his eyes scanning for the leader. The man was using his horse as cover, firing in quick bursts toward the porch. Clara's shovel connected again, this time with the wrist of the second man near the well. He yelped, dropped his pistol, and scrambled back. But a shot tore past her shoulder, splintering the well cover, and she went down hard, the wind knocked from her. Jonas saw her fall and felt something hot rise in his chest. He broke from his position, sprinting toward her, shots kicking dust at his heels. He dropped beside her, pulling her behind the trough. "You hit." She shook her head, sucking in air. "Not yet." They stayed low, exchanging fire with the men still mounted. One horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider, and another man cursed as Jonas's bullet grazed his arm. The fight turned messy. Men shouting, horses snorting, the dry air thick with the smell of gunpowder. The leader shouted something to his crew, and Jonas caught the words, "Circle the barn." Two of the rustlers broke off, galloping wide. Jonas's gut went cold. They were going to try and flank them, maybe set fire to the barn as cover. He pressed the rifle into Clara's hands. "Keep their heads down," he said, and before she could argue, he was moving, sprinting for the barn with his revolver drawn. One of the riders swung in close, a torch in hand. Jonas fired once, the man jerking in the saddle before sliding to the ground. The torch rolled into the dust, sputtering out. The second man raised his pistol, but Clara's rifle cracked from the trough, and the rustler dropped, clutching his side. The leader saw his men falling and knew the tide had shifted. He pulled his horse around, firing one last wild shot toward Jonas before spurring away. The remaining riders followed, some wounded, all empty-handed. Jonas stood there, chest heaving, watching them disappear into the heat shimmer. He waited until the dust settled before lowering his gun. Clara came up beside him, the rifle still warm in her hands. "You think they'll try again?" "Not soon," he said. "Not after this." They dragged the wounded man from near the well and tied him to a post. Jonas would take him into town come morning, let the sheriff sort it out. For now, they needed to see the damage. The well cover was splintered, one of the ropes cut clean through, but the spring was untouched, the water still seeping steady into the lined pool. Clara crouched beside it, dipping her fingers in, letting the drops fall back into the earth. "They almost took it," she said softly. "They didn't," Jonas replied, "because you stood your ground." She looked up at him, the dust in her hair, the grit on her face. "So did you." They spent the next hours repairing what they could, mending the well cover, boarding up holes in the barn where bullets had punched through. When the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, the air cooling enough to ease the day's ache from their bones. Jonas studied her in the fading light. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's dangerous," she said, but there was a smile in her voice. "You found that spring. You fought for it. You could take the water and go anywhere you want." "I could," she said, watching the horizon where the last of the sun bled away. "But anywhere else, I'd just be starting over. Here, there's something worth staying for." He was quiet for a moment. "Stay then. Not as a hand. As a partner. We'll run the place together." Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Partners share everything. The land, the water." "And the work," he said. "And the work." They sealed it with a handshake, the kind that meant more than any paper. In the weeks that followed, the spring grew into a well, its sides shored with proper timber. Crops began to take root in the garden, green shoots stubborn against the baked earth. The cattle grew stronger, their hides glossy again. Word spread, and neighbors began to come by, not with threats but with barter, eggs for water, feed for seedlings. One afternoon, Jonas found Clara by the well, filling a bucket. She was humming under her breath, a tune he didn't recognize. When she saw him, she paused. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just been a long time since this place sounded like it was living again." She smiled and went back to filling the bucket. The drought didn't end overnight. The sky stayed stingy with rain, and the heat kept its grip on the land. But the Black Ranch stood firm, a green patch in the middle of the dust. And at night, when the stars came out sharp and bright, Jonas would sit on the porch and think of the day she'd walked up to his gate, stubborn enough to challenge a man who'd stopped believing in anything but his own shadow. The wells had been empty then, empty as his heart, but she'd found water where he saw none. In the end, she hadn't just saved his land. She'd save him. And if you asked him how, he'd tell you the truth, that sometimes the frontier didn't just test your strength. Sometimes it gave you someone who made it worth using. Because water, like hope, was only worth something if you fought to keep it. And they'd fight for it together for as long as the land would have them. The first frost came early that year, creeping into the night like a thief. Jonas woke to see the edges of the trough glinting white, the air sharp enough to bite his lungs. The cold was a mercy. It slowed the drought's chokehold on the land, kept the water in the well from vanishing into the air. But cold had its own hunger, and it gnawed at man and beast alike. Clara came out of the barn with her breath rising in pale clouds, a burlap sack slung over her shoulder. "Two of the calves are shivering," she said. "We'll need more shelter for them." Jonas nodded, already thinking through what timber they had left, what could be cut from the far fence without inviting trouble. His gaze drifted toward the ridge. "We'll manage it." But his voice carried a tension she didn't miss. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Rider tracks. Fresh ones, up by the North Trail." Clara's grip on the sack tightened. "Them again." "Could be," Jonas said. "Could be someone worse." That afternoon, as they worked on shoring up the barn for the cold, Clara kept catching Jonas glancing toward the horizon. His movements were measured, like a man saving his strength for something bigger. The air felt weighted, each quiet moment stretching too long. By dusk, they knew. A plume of dust rolled in from the north, catching the last gold light of the sun. 6 riders this time, maybe more, shapes shifting in the shimmer. Jonas didn't need to see faces to know the truth. They'd come for the well, and this time they weren't leaving without it. He and Clara didn't speak much as they prepared. Jonas loaded the rifle with deliberate care, checked the revolver at his hip. Clara fetched the extra rounds from the kitchen and tucked her small pistol into the waistband of her skirt. She also grabbed the shovel, the same one she'd swung in the last fight, its handle worn smooth under her grip. By the time the riders reached the gate, the sun was bleeding into the earth, the sky streaked in purple and fire. The leader, tall and thin as a fence post, dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dust with a deliberate thud. "Evenin', Black," he called. "We've talked enough about this water. Tonight, we take it." Jonas stood at the porch rail, rifle across his chest. "Come try." The leader smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hid knife. "We've been watching you. Towns talking, trading with neighbors, fattening your herd. You got more than you need, and some of us got nothing. You had the same chance as everyone else," Jonas said. "You wasted it." The leader's eyes flicked to Clara. "She's the one found it, ain't she? Shame to spill blood over a woman's work." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "You spill blood here, it'll be yours first." A low laugh rolled from the men behind him, but Jonas didn't miss the flicker in the leader's gaze. It was the look of a man trying to weigh risk against reward. He made his choice. With a sharp whistle, the riders spread out, circling the barn, the house, the well. The first shots came from the left flank, shattering the trough. Jonas fired back, his round dropping one man from the saddle. Clara dashed low across the yard, cutting toward the well where 2 riders had dismounted. She swung the shovel hard, knocking the rifle from one man's grip. He lunged for her, but she slammed the flat of the blade into his jaw, sending him sprawling. Jonas took the second man before he could aim, the rifle's crack echoing across the yard. But another rider burst from the far side of the barn, a lit torch in his hand. Jonas pivoted, squeezing off a shot that missed by inches. The man threw the torch toward the barn doors, the flames licking greedily at the dry wood. Clara didn't hesitate. She charged, snatching up the torch and smothering it against the dirt, her skirt catching sparks that she slapped out with her bare hands. She winced, but didn't stop moving, grabbing the fallen rider's pistol and firing toward the fence line. The leader ducked behind his horse, returning fire. Jonas took cover behind the porch post, with splintering near his head. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the stench of powder burning his throat. Then came a sound he didn't like, hoofbeats, fast from the north. Reinforcements. 3 more riders barreled in, guns already spitting fire. Jonas shouted for Clara, but she was already moving toward the house, her pistol snapping in clean rhythm. One of the new riders pitched sideways, falling hard into the dust. They fought in bursts, close, dirty work, bullets snapping past ears, boots slipping in churned dirt. Jonas's shoulder burned where a round had grazed him, but he kept firing, reloading with hands that felt carved from stone. Clara's voice cut through the chaos. "Jonas, the well." He turned in time to see two men hauling at the cover, one with a crowbar prying at the rope. Jonas charged, slamming into the closer one, sending them both crashing to the ground. They rolled, trading blows, Jonas's fists driven by something deeper than anger. This was survival. The man got a hand to Jonas's throat, squeezing, but Jonas found the knife on his belt and brought the hilt down across the man's temple. The grip loosened, and Jonas shoved him away, just as Clara's pistol barked once, dropping the second man by the well. For a breath, the yard went still. The only sounds were labored breathing, the shuffle of hooves. Then the leader's voice rang out, sharp as a whip, "Fall back!" Jonas looked up to see him spurring hard for the road, the remaining riders following in a ragged retreat. One threw a glance over his shoulder, eyes black with promise. They'd be back, given half a chance. Jonas stood in the dust, chest heaving, watching until they were nothing but shadows swallowed by the horizon. Clara leaned on the shovel, her hair loose, face streaked with soot. "We kept it," she said. Jonas nodded. "For now." They moved slow through the wreckage, gathering dropped weapons, checking the livestock, making sure no one still breathing lay in the dust. The barn doors bore deep scorches where the torch had kissed them, but the flames hadn't caught. The trough was split, the fence line in shambles, but the well, blessedly, was untouched. Later, as the cold settled in deep, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, mugs of coffee cradled in their hands. Jonas's shoulder throbbed, but it was a small thing against the weight of what they'd just held off. "You know they'll try again," Clara said quietly. "Maybe," Jonas replied, "but they'll think twice before coming light." She studied him for a moment. "You ever think about leaving? Finding a place where you don't have to fight for every drop?" He looked out over the land, the black silhouettes of the cattle, the glint of the well cover under the moon. "I did," he said, "before you showed up." Clara didn't smile, but there was a warmth in her eyes. "Then I guess we're both staying." The night stretched on, the stars sharp and endless above them. The cold bit deep, but they didn't move inside. It felt right to sit there, guarding what was theirs, knowing they'd face whatever came next the same way they'd faced this, together, and in that brittle, frost-painted silence, Jonas found himself thinking that maybe the land wasn't the only thing worth saving anymore. Clara had brought water to his soil, yes, but she'd also brought something back to the man himself, something that felt an awful lot like hope. The well's spring whispered in the dark, steady and unbroken, the kind of sound a man could build a life around.